Hi, this is Glenn Guy, your travel photography guru. Today's presentation will be continuing our exploration of my upcoming photography tour to China during January 2012. And today's presentation will deal with the beautiful Huangshan, or Yellow Mountain, in eastern China. And an absolutely gorgeous place to visit. Great opportunities for landscape and nature photography, and the mountain photographs well in either colour or black and white. So remembering that January is winter in China, the mountain will be covered in snow and there'll be some icy patches along the trail. But I was there at the same time this year, 2011, and I was able to traverse along the very well-made pathways. Rather than climbing up the mountain and descending the mountain by foot, I suggest that we take the cable car both up and down the mountain, spend more time on the mountain itself photographing. So what are we going to be photographing on Huangshan? Clearly snow, ice, trees and rock, a simplistic understanding of what there is to photograph. But today I want to talk about some different approaches. Tones, the difference between light and dark and how different tones relate to each other within an image. Contrast. Is there a big contrast between the light and dark tones, or are they squeezed closer together? How does that change the look and feel of the image? Textures. There's plenty of texture in tree trunks, for instance. Shapes. The trees cut interesting shapes against the white snow. Dualities, or opposites, of light and dark, hard and soft, air and ground. Air and ground clearly would be, up in the mountains. Hard and soft could be seen to be the rocks and trees versus the snow. Light and dark, the light tonalities of the snow and ice against the dark tonalities of the trees and rocks. And I just suggest that if we take this more interesting approach to what we're photographing, we will actually be making superior pictures. We can also look at exploring narrative, storytelling, message. How do we feel about what we're photographing? Let's put our personal stamp on our photographs. As well as being clearly a bridge, the image starts to work on a different level because of the shape that's introduced, the semicircular shape of the bridge. So now there's kind of a drawing aspect that's added to the image. But most of the images on the mountain were made with the Canon 5D Mark II and a Canon 24-105 f4L series lens. For those that like the techie details, the images were exposed at ISOs between 1 and 800, but most of the images were made at 100, and the shutter speeds varied from 1/500th of a second. There's one frame in this presentation made at that shutter speed, way down to 6 seconds. So clearly a tripod was employed for the long exposure, and my average shutter speed seemed to be about a 40th of a second handheld. Trees in snow, but I would argue that it's really a shot about lines and the relationship between those lines in the photograph. And there's a shape, a V shape, that is produced from the top left corner going down to the center and back out to the right corner. There's also the relationship between the two trees in the foreground and that out of focus tree directly behind them in the background. Very light tonality. It's basically a high key image, and my definition of high key is when the majority of tones are above mid-tone, so they're light tones. But a high key image works better if there's a black or a near black in the photograph, and that actually helps to shape the image. I think that's a very important point. Notice how the shape of the image, one side mirrors the other, and the fence line is actually creating a pathway up towards the tree in the center of the image. More abstract rendering, and I would argue here that the lines and crisscross shapes in the fence, the diamond shapes created, are actually as important as the vertical lines of the trees in the background. So, as you start to photograph, a personal approach will often emerge. You don't really have to know what you're trying to say or what the pictures are about in the beginning. I think for the vast majority of people, including myself, our best work comes if we don't burden ourselves with those concerns. The best work comes intuitively. The theme, the message you're trying to explore actually appears through the photographs you make. But rather than waiting until you get home and discovering what your photos are about, it's just good to stop for a moment every now and again, look at a few of the images on the screen and start to see some trends, some stylistic approaches coming through. And whatever it appears that you're doing well, make a deliberate attempt to do more of the same. Ultimately, our images tell stories. It's always great to look for iconic images, but also fleeting moments. And I think we should concentrate on the intimate image just as much as on the grand image. And Huangshan really is a magnificent location, so it's well suited to the grand, but you'll find if you take the time, there'll be lots of quiet moments where we can just pick details out of the landscape, and they may well be your best shots. They're certainly going to be the more personal shots that you make. And this photograph could be interpreted in many ways. It's a journey photograph, really, I suppose. So I discovered on the first day that I was actually making shots that dealt with pathways and journey, which is a very interesting metaphor. You can see part of the track in the background. The trail leads you across the top of the mountains, and the trail is usually in very good condition. But if we're out very early in the morning, then the trails would not have been swept, and so they can be a little bit slippery underfoot. But if you have decent shoes, you'll be able to cope with that, as I did, without any trouble. Weather can move across the mountain, so it's necessary to prepare yourself by dressing for cold climates. And this is one of the steeper sections. It's a little bit taxing in parts. I would have walked several hours every day, but no more than 3 hours, I'd say, on any day. Travelling from one hotel to the next, there'll be 3 hotels that we'll stay at whilst on the mountain. So you probably walk for about an hour and a half after breakfast to get to that day's accommodation. You have a rest, go out again and do some more photography, and maybe walk around a little bit more. Come back, have another rest, and go out again for the sunset. Weather had certainly closed in on this pass, and here's another image that tells a story, doesn't it, about the hardships of some of the local workers. And metaphor, what does this image tell us about the human condition? Probably one of my favourite photographs from the trip. And again, every now and again, you'll find these pathways that haven't been swept, and there may even be some ice as a consequence forming on them. You take your time. After about a minute, you're fine. And I found that probably happened to me about half a dozen times while I was on the mountain. So nothing to sweat about. And the areas that are more likely to have ice form on them, there are these handrails, which make it much, much safer. We have a whole day to get from one hotel to the next, and the walk, as I say, on average would be about an hour and a half. So plenty of time to stop and make pictures. One of the higher points on the track. Certainly it's interesting to push yourself as much as possible. Certainly get the images that you expect to make, the safe ones, but once you've done a bit of that, just always push to try to find more interesting ways to make pictures, and moving in towards abstraction is one way to do that. By that I mean that realism is when you can clearly identify the subject of the photograph as being a tree or a rock, a mountainside. Suggestion is when, as well as having those elements in the picture, they start to suggest something other than what they are. For instance, a snow-laden tree will suggest something other than just a tree, because we will read it as an image of hardship. We bring the human condition to that reading of the photograph. And abstraction is really when the picture is no longer about the tree. The design elements in the image, like shape, line, texture, colour, etc., they actually become what we're drawn to first when we look at the picture. And we may then think, oh, it's a tree. So the subject matter in that case is actually the design. And of course, again, exploring the narrative, the story in the photograph, and linking photographs together as part of the editing process to enhance that story, and where possible explore metaphor, where the picture takes us beyond what's immediately in front of the camera and suggests to us something greater. It's not hard to do that when you're in the landscape in a beautiful location. The images that I've made in this presentation, to me, are very much about the journey of traversing across the mountaintop. They depict weather, silence, space, emptiness. And I think that's a nicer way of looking at it rather than saying they depict mountain, tree, ice, snow, pathways. Of those words, pathway is probably the more interesting to me because it suggests something other than just a pathway. When I came to edit my work, I noticed that there were other subsections, if you like, of the journey, and they were photographs of trees, for instance. Yes, it's a photograph of trees, but hopefully there is some emotive quality that adds something extra to that photograph. You notice, hopefully, the warm, cool tonalities in this picture. I think that's one of the things that makes it interesting, because, of course, that's introducing dualities, opposites in the photograph. Very much a textual image and working with contrast, light against dark, delicate against solid. Worm's eye point of view, great way to show the size of the overhanging tree. And again, something much more delicate. Predominantly a high key image because most of the tones are mid-tones or brighter, but you can see the essential need to have a black in the picture because it's that really gives us the shape and contrast. It's that cuts the tree away from the brighter background. And I'd also argue that the black branches at the bottom here add a stability to the image, as well as, of course, adding a stability to the upper branches of the tree. And sometimes the best way to photograph a forest is to concentrate on a single tree. Indeed, sometimes the best way to photograph a forest is to concentrate on a single leaf or twig. So it's likely on the mountain, as we'll be staying there for a few days, that we'll get to experience a range of weather. Predominantly I experienced this weather, which was mist, heavy white cloud, which was wonderful really because it just covered the whole world up there in a very soft, flattering light. It made it technically easy to make pictures. And you can see what happens with the mist or the fog because it does obscure details in the landscape, but you just wait and the fog will then reveal details in that same landscape. So accommodation, meals, internal flights and local transport are all included in the cost. Photography theory sessions, prac sessions relating to each location, and image processing assistance and sessions will also be provided. We'll be doing sunrises and sunsets whenever we can, weather permitting. Quite a bit of variety photographing on the mountain over those few days because the terrain does change a little bit from location to location. Exclusions would be airfares to and from China, your own drinks and snacks, any accommodation and associated costs prior to the commencement of the tour or after it's concluded. So Huangshan, a most beautiful location, one of the best times I've ever had photographing, is truly extraordinary, and I really do hope that I can share the experience with as many of you as possible during January 2012. You can find me on my blog at travelphotographyguru.com, facebook.com/travelphotographyguru, twitter.com/travelphotoguru. Until then, thanks so much.